Good day, Puyo Poppers! I'm back with another excuse to talk about the Game Boy, or more specifically, the Super Game Boy. As a quick primer, the Super Game Boy is an accessory for the Super NES released in 1994 that lets you play Game Boy games on a Super Nintendo. Pretty simple in concept, but they've actually squeezed the entire original Game Boy hardware into that cartridge. The Super Game Boy is able to tap into the Super NES hardware to provide all sorts of enhancements, including color palettes and borders. Select games are even specifically enhanced for the Super Game Boy, with colorization and borders specific to that game, sometimes even audio enhancements like sound effects or music. But one of the most interesting yet overlooked features of the Super Game Boy is that some games feature local multiplayer modes. And I don't mean using the Game Link cable either, I'm talking simultaneous play with multiple controllers. Killer Instinct is perhaps one of the more well-known examples out there, but it's actually quite a common feature seen in many Game Boy fighting games. Wait, you didn't know there was a Game Boy port of Killer Instinct? Oh man, let me tell you about Killer Instinct. Killer Instinct is an arcade fighting game developed by Rare, who were known at the time for the Battletoads and Donkey Kong Country games, which also saw some quite excellent Game Boy adaptations. The original arcade version pushed pre-rendered 3D visuals that were quite impressive for the time. There's so much here that it needed a hard disk drive to store it all on, Killer Instinct in fact being the first arcade machine to utilize one. The storage media of home consoles just couldn't handle graphics quite like this, but the Super NES version still manages to come across quite excellently. With all of this in mind, Killer Instinct is a game that really shouldn't work on the Game Boy, and indeed, concessions were made to make it work, with the roster missing Cinder and Riptor, and moves altered to fit the Game Boy's limited buttons. But you know what? It works. Kind of. Probably. Maybe not. Even the often derided Game Boy adaptation of Street Fighter 2 has 2-player support, and I bet you didn't know that it could do this. That's pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. And to be honest, it's actually quite playable. There's definitely worse versions of Street Fighter 2 out there. While the Game Boy version is sluggish and missing characters, I usually don't have much trouble pulling off special moves. Don't take that as a recommendation, of course, but yeah. Of course, it is quite superfluous when the many SNES versions of Street Fighter 2 sold millions apiece and were already in basically everyone's SNES libraries. But it's the little touches that I can't help but appreciate. While I've talked about these games in their own video, I can't not mention that Takara's NeoGeo ports all have excellent Super Game Boy support. Released under the Netto or Dead Heat Fighters label in Japan, Takara were porting over arcade hits to the Game Boy long after the SNES stopped being most publishers' main focus. And honestly, I can't complain at all if this is the only way to play the King of Fighters on Super NES. It's actually really good. If you're somehow not impressed by tiny versions of NeoGeo games, or Battle Arena Toshinden, let me introduce you to Ketto Beast Wars. This is actually a Game Boy Color title, but it's built on the lineage of the Netto series, sharing much of its gameplay with the KOF games and Real Bout Special. It's still very much a Game Boy fighting game, but it stands in the Hall of Fame for its amazing Super Game Boy support, not to mention its originality. And I just really love Beast Wars. It looks nicer on the GBC in full color, but they went all out with the Super Game Boy support here. So what other fighting games are worth mentioning? Well, Shaq Fu supports the Super Game Boy, and wait, even 2 players? But this is honestly less playable than Street Fighter 2. Do the Mortal Kombat games have Super Game Boy enhancements? Nope. Except Mortal Kombat 4, but we don't talk about that one. How about Primal Rage? Nope. Even though it says it's a Super Game Boy game on the box, at least in North America, the Europe cover fixes this error. Bit of a head scratcher, that one. Here's an interesting one. Super Chinese Fighter GB from Culture Brain. This is a fighting game in the Super Chinese series, with previous games in the series released in America with titles like Kung Fu Heroes and Little Ninja Brothers. Previous entries in the series were action games or action RPGs, but this one is a fighting game. It's sort of a follow-up to the SNES Super Chinese Fighter title, but this one is its own original game, and it honestly gives those Takara NeoGeo ports a run for their money. Super Chinese Fighter is very much of that era of Street Fighter 2 clones, but with its cast of wacky characters and items, it really doesn't take itself too seriously. Maybe I should revisit this series properly sometime. There was also Super Chinese Fighter EX for the Game Boy Color, but unfortunately this one is incompatible with the original Game Boy and Super Game Boy. Two-player modes weren't just seen in fighting games though. Many Game Boy puzzle games do indeed have Super Game Boy support, but the Game Boy versions of these games usually rely on the link cable for multiplayer, likely due to visibility concerns with the small, low-resolution screen. A game like Money Puzzle Exchanger would be impossible if you couldn't read the values on the coins. Puyo Puyo, on the other hand, relies heavily on being able to see what the opponent is up to so you can react accordingly. So the developers of the Game Boy ports made sure not to compromise on this, and indeed, these games have two-player support on the Super Game Boy. Unfortunately, the first game is a bit of a mess. It's barely visible on a real Game Boy, and it's jerky and unresponsive. Interestingly, they actually went to the effort of fully colorizing each individual Puyo on the Super Game Boy, but programming a game like this comes at a significant performance cost. There's no reason to play this, like, at all. There's a lot wrong with this version of Puyo Puyo that was resolved in the sequels, now sporting the Pocket naming, mirroring the SNES's Super Puyo Puyo. Pocket Puyo Puyo 2 is fast and responsive, retains the two-player mode, and has really cute border, but isn't in color at all. The lack of color isn't as much of a hindrance as you'd think, since the Puyo graphics are much more distinct this time. I've played this on a real Game Boy, and it's not ideal, but it's fine, really. It's certainly more playable than the first one. Of course, Puyo Puyo 1 and 2 were already on the Super Nintendo, with the first one even being localized as Kirby's Ghost Trap, or Kirby's Avalanche in North America, but there's no Super Nintendo version of Puyo Puyo Sun. Pocket Puyo Puyo Sun is actually a Game Boy Color title, but it inherits Puyo Puyo 2's Super Game Boy support, though it's clearly an afterthought, but it is technically the only way to play Puyo Puyo Sun on the Super NES. It plays great and has some nice full screen cutscene art, but it's really not remotely as charming as the original arcade and console game. Being in monochrome on the Super Game Boy really takes away from both presentation and playability. And for completeness sake, the fourth game, Pocket Puyo Puyon, is unfortunately a Game Boy Color only title, so no Super Game Boy support here. Both of these games were on the N64 in Japan anyway, though personally I prefer the other console versions for their CD quality music and full voice acting. Why stop at 2 controllers? Check this out! Bomberman Game Boy with 4 players on the Super Game Boy, utilizing Hudson Soft's Super Multitap. Maybe this is a little cramped compared to the likes of Super Bomberman, but it's a cool touch. Wario Blast featuring Bomberman isn't left out either. I mean, it's pretty much just a reskinned Bomberman GB. The Bomberman GB we got is actually Japanese Bomberman GB 2, and there's a Bomberman GB 3 we didn't get. Chronology! It's confusing! There's something just so specifically mid to late 90s about Wario being so marketable for Game Boy owners that even a known series like Bomberman gets reskinned as Wario. I have no idea if it actually boosted sales, but I mean, it had to, right? I know the Wario games meant a lot to me back then, particularly Wario Land 3. This actually gives Wario Blast featuring Bomberman the interesting honor of being the only Mario related product to support the Super Multitap. And it's a Game Boy game at that. As much as I would love to keep talking about the Super Game Boy, I think I've gone on for plenty long enough this time. Do you know any Game Boy games with cool Super Game Boy enhancements that you'd like me to talk about? Please let me know in the comments below and maybe we can make another one of these. Anyway, that's it for now. If you want to support my channel and other creative endeavors, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And of course, like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and consider watching some of the other great Game Boy related videos on my channel. Thank you everyone for watching. Hope to catch you next time.